Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader. And in this video, we're going over Immanuel Kant. And we'll be comparing him to everyone else we have studied so far in this chapter in preparation for exam 2. So the questions we'll be going over for the second exam, part A, number 3. How is Kant's view of knowledge different than the rationalist and empiricist views earlier in part 3? Is his argument an improvement on the views of his predecessors? Why? Explain. So that's what we'll be going over for the most part. And then for part B, questions 8 and 9, what is the difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge? So that's question 8. And number 9, what is the difference between analytic and synthetic judgments? Okay. This is difficult material, and I will try to keep it as simple as I can, but you just can't keep it that simple when you're dealing with Immanuel Kant. So empiricism and rationalism, those are the two alternatives in epistemology, the study of human knowledge. What can we know? One of the fundamental questions we're studying in this class. Who or what am I? What can I know? What is real? What should I do? When I first started teaching this class almost 8 years ago, the book was 4 Fundamental Questions, Richard Bilsker's anthology. I got it right here. Here, I'll show you. This was an oldie but a goodie, the 4 Fundamental Questions. So I like the order that book is organized in because it starts with who or what am I? This book, it started with a general introduction to what is philosophy, and then we went to epistemology. In the next section, we'll be going into, they're calling it reality, but that includes what is a self. So it seems to me these 4 fundamental questions are a little bit confused in this book, and it makes these exam questions a little hard to go over because these are the exam questions prepared by Richard Bilsker for this new book that we're going over. So how is Kant's view of knowledge different than the rationalists and empiricist views? Well, as we saw, the only rationalists we saw in this book so far, in this part 3 of the book about knowledge, was Descartes and Leibniz, and they were both very short excerpts compared to the much longer excerpts from the empiricists. So we've got a lot more knowledge about what the empiricists say than what the rationalists say, which is why I had us read, in addition to the Descartes section here in part 3, I said also if you're going to discuss Descartes, include the reading from him in part 4, starting on page 100, which is just a continuation of the reading that we have here. So I'll get into that, briefly review it. I already put videos out about Descartes and Locke and Berkeley and Hume. So now we're at Kant, so I'll try to keep my summary of those other philosophers very brief. But let me give an overview of these two schools and how Kant tries to synthesize them. He tries to bring them together. So the rationalists basically say that we are eternal souls separate from the material world, and that our souls are imprinted with certain innate forms of knowledge. Or at least we have reason which enables us to discern truth independent of our sense perceptions of the outer world. And as I say that, I'm questioning myself because I think both Descartes and Leibniz and Plato would say you need to have sense impressions to start the process going, but once you have that, then your reason is able to draw out certain absolute truths about the universe that and that's rationalism. You can have these absolute certain truths through human reason. They should have included Plato. We read Plato's Phaedo in the previous section, but not his epistemological theory of these absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. It would have made life a little bit easier and given a little more foundation to compare rationalism to empiricism. It would have provided more. But at any rate, in our very brief reading from Descartes, what he first started out doing was doubting everything the senses could teach him. Let's just assume there's some evil demon forcing him to have these hallucinations. Is there anything that we can still know for certain, even if that's the worst case scenario? And he says, yes, I can know that I exist because I think. Even if all my thoughts are delusions, I'm having delusions. You can't have delusions if you're not a thinking being. So I know I exist because I think. I think, therefore I am. That's his famous reason can assure him of that one undoubtable, indubitable truth. And then, although it's not included in our book here, he says, from that you can derive the certainty of the existence of God, because the human mind has the idea of perfect, infinite power and wisdom and goodness. There's nothing in the empirically observable world that correlates to those concepts. So what caused that concept to occur in our mind? It must have a cause, he says. Everything has a cause. Therefore, there must be, in fact, this supreme God. And then based on that assumption, we can trust the correlation between our rational conception of the material world and the material world itself, that there is a trustworthy, we do have trustworthy ideas of the way the outer material, mechanically interacting world operates, because there is this perfect God, and a perfect God wouldn't lie and lead us into false assumptions about, oh, I see an object, I pick it up, and yes, this is a cassette tape, Miles Davis, Agartha. Or maybe I'm just dreaming that. No, you can be certain it's not just a dream, because you can be certain there's this all-powerful God, and God wouldn't deceive you. All right, so that part about God wasn't included in our book, but it's necessary to understand Descartes' rationalism. Certain absolute truths we can have based on reason. Now, the empiricists say, no, our knowledge comes from sense perceptions. We're born a blank slate, tabula rasa, and a blank tablet, and then every sense impression we have writes a little bit of information on our mind. And then our mind has these powers to organize this information and reflect on it through memory, and we discern through all of these individual experiences certain regularly repeating patterns that guide us through life. We know what to expect because we've seen the way things have worked in the past, but that does not give us absolute certain knowledge of the way things work. It only gives us probable knowledge of the way things will probably unfold in the future based on the fact that they have always unfolded that way in the past, at least as far as we've observed them. Maybe in the distant past, it didn't work that way, but at least we can be pretty sure it will probably unfold that way. That is what the empiricists are saying. Knowledge comes from outside, from our sense perceptions. Okay. And that was John Locke and Berkeley and Hume. And Berkeley was an outlier in there because he says, yes, all we have is knowledge of our sense impressions. But sense impressions are just that, sense impressions. There's no outer material object that correlates to our sense impressions. So I'll get into some of these differences. Okay, so knowledge is imprinted innately on our soul. Absolute certain knowledge of the universe that rational humans can have, say the rationalists, like Descartes and Leibniz. Leibniz brought in the idea of an unconscious mind, that he said, oh, where are these innate ideas? We're not immediately aware of them. Well, they're in this, he didn't use the word unconscious mind, but this potential mind that we have, where our memories are stored as well. So at any rate, rationalists, Descartes and Leibniz, originally Plato, not covered in our book. That we will talk about Plato in the Republic, the Cave Allegory later. So like I said, the organization of the book, I would have organized it differently, but at any rate, empiricist knowledge comes from our sense impressions. whether or not those sense impressions correlate to physical objects outside of our mind. How did Immanuel Kant try to synthesize empiricists and rationalists? And that is his idea of these a priori categories of thought. And this is, I'll give you the three main ones: space, time, and causality. And I think that is one of the most valuable things you can get out of this introductory philosophy class. If you don't really learn anything else, to me, it just seems here's something that's easy to understand and has enormous implications about our knowledge of the universe and what we are as human beings. And it's this concept of space. So the empiricists tell us all knowledge comes from sense impressions. Okay, sights and sounds and smells and tastes and touches. What about space? All of our sense impressions are occurring in a context of space. We see things organized, either they're close to us or they're far us, even or far from us. If we hear things, they can sound close or far away. It's not so evident with smelling, but odors become more intense the closer you get. So at any rate, our sense impressions are experienced in a context of space and time. They come in a sequence. One happens after another. But space and time themselves are not empirically observable. This was a big point to me that just seems easy to comprehend, and it's got a lot of implications. Space, you can't see it, hear it, or touch it, or taste it, or feel it, or time. And then he'll go on to point out the idea of a causal connection between cause and effect. You can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear that. Hume pointed these things out as well. One event happens, and then it's always followed by another event as far as you've ever observed it. And so you insert this causal link that's not actually there. That's what Hume says. All right. Kant's going to say, yes, it's true. You do what Hume says. You insert this causal link between event A and event B that you've seen it regularly occurring together. And you furthermore experience these sense impressions in the context of space and time. But unlike what David Hume says, that's not a result of human habit, that over time, having all these sense impressions, you gradually develop the habit of perceiving them in a context of space and time and linking these sequences, these regularly recurring sequences, by these causal chains of cause and effect relationships. You don't form a habit of doing that, says Kant. That is innate to the human mind. You're forced to do that. That our minds automatically organize our sense impressions for us. So now here's a difference between Kant and John Locke. John Locke, even though he knew there were problems with it, he assumed there is a correspondence between our senses, our sense perceptions of things, and actual objects outside of our mind. And he differentiated between primary and secondary qualities. We went over that in the video. Secondary qualities are colors, sounds, tastes, odors. They are a subjective experience that's not inherent to the objects that cause them. A rose doesn't contain a sweet odor. It's just whatever the particles of which the rose is made, and whichever little tiny imperceptible particles emanate from it and interact with the olfactory particles of our sense organ in our nose, which then stimulates the animal's spirits or the brain, is how Locke is describing it. We then register those mechanical movements of tiny little atoms as an odor. So that was John Locke's reasoning. So primary and secondary qualities, but he said the primary qualities, like the shape of the thing and its extension in space, its motion through space, those actually belong to the object. And those are primary qualities, and the ideas we have of them in our minds do correlate to an actual object with those primary qualities inherent in it. Berkeley rejected that distinction, even though he remained an empiricist. Okay, so Kant is maintaining, he agrees with Locke that our sense perceptions do correlate to something outside of our mind, but he gives up this idea that there is this one-to-one correspondence of the primary qualities in our mind. Oh, this thing weighs this much, it's this shape, it is this long. That's what Locke said. Yeah, we can have true knowledge. Those ideas in our mind are not the same things as the things outside of our mind, says Locke will admit, but they match up perfectly. We can trust that. And then he'll later says, well, yeah, maybe it's a dream, but do you really think it is? Why don't you stick your hand in the fire, you know, if you think it's a dream, which was kind of weak reasoning. But at any rate, Kant will say, no, you can't know what that thing is in itself. The thing in itself, prior to being observed by the human mind, is unknowable, because whatever the thing causing our sense impressions of it is, it's unknowable because those sense impressions are radically digested and reconfigured for human consumption. They're fit into a context of space and time, these random discrete sights and smell, all these little tiny sense impressions are linked together in causal relationships. So it's so radically organized for us that there's no way we can know what the thing that's causing these mental representations are in themselves. So says Kant. So he'll say, I agree with the empiricists, especially Hume, who he said woke me from my dogmatic slumber, that we cannot have certain knowledge of the thing in itself, that our empirical observations of do not give us absolute knowledge of the way things are in themselves. However, he agreed with the rationalists that we do have absolute certain knowledge of the way the world appears to us, that Newtonian physics do give us absolute certain knowledge, but not in the naive sense of telling us how the universe actually works, independent of human observation, but rather they tell us exactly how the thing in itself, which we might call the universe, will be perceived by any human being anywhere in the universe, because human beings all have these same inborn, innate categories of thought, a priori, before experience. Before you have any sense impressions, your mind is already structured in a way that it's going to digest incoming sense impressions in a very specific way, specifically in a context of three-dimensional space, linear time, and this idea of cause and effect. 20th century physics is going to complicate this because of the ideas of three-dimensional space, although that is how we naturally perceive the world. Mathematical physics says it's more appropriate, says Einstein, to see it as a four-dimensional space-time continuum. And as I'll talk about in later videos, string theory says the three dimensions of space we experience are not the only dimensions of space. There's at least six others twisted in these tiny little shapes at every point of three-dimensional space. So at any rate, that's going to complicate the matter. But there's a basic summary of what Kant did. He synthesized. The rationalists claimed absolute certain knowledge. They said because we have innate ideas imprinted on our soul, so we can have certain knowledge of the universe. The empiricists say, no, we can have at best probable knowledge based on past sense impressions of the way things unfolded in the past. Kant says we can, yes, we can have certain knowledge of the way the universe will appear to the human mind, but that doesn't give us any certainty of the way the thing in itself, outside of observation, what it actually is. All right, so there's a general overview. Now let me get into some of the specifics. I'll just read through these. Unlike the readings by Descartes and Leibniz, there's at least a few more pages here for Kant. So page 85, let me just start reading some bits and pieces here, and then I'll make some comparisons to the other philosophers as I go. So there can be no doubt. So this is page 85. The Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant, born 1724, he died 1804. So Isaac Newton's physics were in place since 1787. And he's saying what he's trying to figure out in his mind is how could Newton have given us what appears to be this actual description of universal laws that are perfectly predictive? And then David Hume's claim that that should have been impossible. Kant agrees with that Newton did describe these absolute certain truths, and yet he agrees with Hume's reasoning that that should have been impossible. How was it possible? The Critique of Pure Reason, Chapter 1, the distinction between pure and empirical knowledge. So he says, there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. Whenever he says experience, he means sense experience, sights, sounds, smells, touches, tastes. For how should our faculty of knowledge be awakened into action, did not objects affecting our senses partly of themselves produce representations, partly arouse the activity of our understanding to compare these representations, and by combining or separating them, work up the raw material of the sensible impressions into that knowledge of objects which is entitled experience? All right, that's a long sentence. In the order of time, therefore, we have no knowledge antecedent to experience, and with experience all our knowledge begins. So he's deferring to the empiricists. All knowledge begins with sense impressions. Yes, the empiricists are correct. Now he's going to go and lean over towards the rationalist side. But though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience, for it may well be that even our empirical knowledge is made up of what we receive through impressions, that's sense impressions, and of what our own faculty of knowledge, sensible impressions serving merely as the occasion, supplies from itself. If our faculty of knowledge makes any such addition, it may be said that we are not in a position to distinguish it from the raw material until with long practice of attention we have become skilled in separating it. Every time I read that in these introductory classes, that reminds me of yoga. So in the Hindu tradition, there's different forms of yoga. I've mentioned this before. Hatha yoga is bending the body into different positions and controlling the breath. But Jnana yoga, spelled with a J-Y-A-N-A, but pronounced Jnana, it's bending your mental concepts into different positions. And here Kant is saying, I'm going to teach you how to separate out sense impressions from the organizing principles of your own mind. That sounds like a pretty good thing to know. We saw with Socrates, know thyself. The unexamined life is not worth living. This, the first few readings in the book, the Beardsleys and Bertrand Russell. What's the purpose of philosophy? To clarify our concepts, to help us know what we don't know, to find the fundamental questions about the most general and fundamental questions that we can ask. And here we see this is how it's done. This is a very general and fundamental thing. What can human beings know? And then he's saying, all right, well, let's take our knowledge and separate out the sense impressions from whatever the mind puts into it. And that it takes a long practice of attention. And we have become, and he'll give us techniques for doing it, analyzing sentence structure, and this one thought experiment, which, you know what, I'm just going to skip to it right now. Then I'll go back and it'll help you understand here. So on page 87, all right, this is chapter 2 in his Critique of Pure Reason. The title of the chapter is, We Are in Possession of Certain Modes of A Priori Knowledge, and even the common understanding is never without them. All of our sense impressions are automatically filtered through these inborn categories of thought. This is his claim, which is synthesizing empiricism and rationalism. And here's one of these thought yogic techniques for discovering that for yourself. The one that I mentioned at the beginning, near the beginning of this video, or maybe it was at about minute 10. At any rate, page 87, the left-hand column. Such a priori origin is manifest in certain concepts, no less than in judgments. If we remove from our empirical concept of a body, one by one, every feature in it which is merely empirical, the color, the hardness or softness, the weight, even the impenetrability, there still remains the space which the body, now entirely vanished, occupied, and this cannot be removed. All right, that was it. Imagine a body, imagine a thing. Let's take this cassette tape, which I can still play on my cassette player. Let's remove, like he said, if we remove from our empirical concept of a body, one by one, every feature, which is merely empirical, the color. All right, so what is this? Kind of a dark gray. Now it's just a clear, let's imagine it's just a clear cassette, some more like this one, but without the red. All right, color's gone. The hardness or softness, the weight, even the impenetrability. All right, well, if it's impenetrable, now it's not impenetrable. That means there's nothing there. Now it's just empty space. But that, he says, cannot be removed. So we've reduced everything, and now we're left with empty space. Okay, subtract empty space from your mind. What are you left with? So Kant is going to say, you're left with more empty space. I thought that's just a neat trick. Is that really true? Let me just, try to practice this. Now I have empty space. Now I'm vanishing, dissolving the empty space from my mind. And then sure enough, it seems in my mind there's more empty space. So there you have discovered a category of thought. It's innate, it's inescapable, or at any rate, maybe you can escape it, but not easily. This is something that your sense impressions are forced through, the idea of space. Time is another one, though he doesn't mention it explicitly in our reading here, and the idea of cause and effect. If you push somebody off a cliff and they fall, the court of law would say, you caused that person to die, you murdered them. Maybe you accidentally pushed them, in which case it's accidental homicide, but at any rate, you caused their death. Hume would say, there's no cause. You got close to the person, there was contact between the atoms, that person fell. It's just a sequence of sense perceptions, and then you've inserted this idea of cause and effect. But what does that say for guilt and innocence? And it could say a lot of things. But what Kant is going to say is, it's true, there is no sense impression of this causal link, but the human mind forces our understanding to see it that way. And the evidence that it's a good way to see things is the laws of mathematical physics, because the way Isaac Newton describes interacting bodies extended in space, interacting with the law of gravity and other expressions of fundamental physical principles such as force equals mass times acceleration, and a body in motion tends to stay in motion, and a body at rest tends to stay at rest. These do seem to apply everywhere, infallibly in the universe. So how was that possible? And this is what, and I've been going over it again and again, because it's such an important milestone in philosophy, is Newton's infallible, his physics are infallible, says Kant, because these laws of mathematics that he has superimposed upon empirical observations, they are based on the same principles that all of our human cognitions are based on, space, time, and causality. In our segment, we don't get the part where Kant talks about, he does talk about mathematics, but he doesn't get to unfold in the subsequent chapters. But a teacher of mine who I've been reading for a long time, and I took a couple of classes with him also, Richard Tarnow's The Passion of the Western Mind. So I've read through his summary of the history of philosophy from Descartes through Kant. And one of the things I picked up this time around is that our mathematical conceptions are also automatically conceived in a context of space and time. If you think of 2 + 2 = 4, two objects in your mind, they're placed in your mind's already, you can't think outside of the concept of space, and now two objects, then you have 2 other objects, and that's time. There was 2, and now there's another 2. So there's this temporal sequence in a spatial context that's within which mathematics automatically takes place. Similarly, all of our sense impressions are organized in a context of space and time as well, just like our mathematical understanding. Space and time are not out there. They're not empirically real things. When you look out at the night sky, most of what you're perceiving is your own mind, because space is not out there. That's why it seems to me such an important realization, because, enormity of space, we're such insignificant creatures on Earth. Well then, if you are an empiricist, you'll have to admit space isn't out there. So the enormity of our own mind, look how we're projecting our ordering principles on this vastness of the unknowable thing in itself. That's a different way of looking at the universe. Suddenly, a lot of people say, Kant finalized the Copernican revolution. Kant compared himself to Copernicus. Copernicus looked for the order. How do you explain the movement of the stars on the celestial sphere? It seems so complex based on the assumption that Earth is the center of the universe. But if you assume Earth is revolving around the sun and rotating on its own axis, suddenly the apparent motions of the stars on the celestial sphere make a lot more sense. Similarly, Kant compares himself to Copernicus because he says, if you look for the order of the universe out there in the universe itself, there's no way you could have this kind of certain knowledge, as David Hume has shown us, because all you ever experience are unconnected events occurring in a certain sequence. But if you look for the ordering principles not out there in the universe, but in your own mind, just like the movement of the outer sphere of the stars was caused not by their movement, but by our own movement on Earth, our revolution around the sun and rotation. Similarly, our understanding of the orderly nature of the universe is accounted for not by examining the outer universe, but by perceiving these categories of thought, these a priori categories of thought. Space, time, substance is another one, the concept of substance. We never experience substance. We experience discrete, unconnected, a volley of sense impressions, innumerable sights in such rapid succession that we are under the illusion it's one continuous thing, like a movie. The film is a bunch of frozen frames which pass the projector light at a certain frequency, which gives the illusion of a continuously unfolding scene. Similarly, all these unconnected sense impressions are happening so quickly that we perceive solid, continuous objects. But closer scrutiny says, no, these are just a volley of sense impressions that the mind perceives as continuously existing objects. It's the mind that's creating the order in the world, and even the very existence of continuously existing objects. Okay, so I kind of went off there a little bit just to say, all right, space. There's one of the categories of thought. It's not out there in the empirical world, but it's not, as Hume says, some habit of thought that we just randomly developed. Rather, it's forced upon us. It's this inborn category of thought, says Kant. And this is how he's synthesizing empiricism and rationalism. All right, so back to page 85. If our faculty of knowledge makes any such addition, it may be that we are not in a position to distinguish it from the raw material of sense impressions until with long practice of attention we have become skilled in separating it. So we just did a little bit of attention at separating space out from the other sense impressions we have of the world, which are placed in the context of space. Continuing, this then is a question which at least calls for closer examination and does not allow any offhand answer. So he's getting us ready for deep and difficult thinking. Offhand answers aren't going to cut it. This is going to have to be a long practice of attention. Whether there is any knowledge that is thus independent of experience and even of all impressions of the senses, such knowledge is entitled a priori and distinguished from the empirical, which has its sources a posteriori, that is, in experience. So a priori knowledge and a posteriori. A posteriori means after you've experienced it, then you know it. I know fire burns the finger. Why? Because When I was little, I touched a fire and it burned my finger. That's a posteriori knowledge. Is there any knowledge that's possible a priori, before you've experienced it? Could you have known that that fire would burn you? Hume, at any rate, will say no. Well, is there anything that you can know a priori? Well, Kant will say no. Sense impressions start the whole process moving. You have to have sense impressions to get the ball rolling. But once you have those sense impressions, then you activate these categories of thought, and those are what are a priori knowledge. Our experience of space is a priori. You don't have to, it is started with sense impressions, but it doesn't come from sense impressions. Sense impressions trigger the need for our categories of thought to activate, but those categories of thought are independent of sense impressions. If that makes sense. I'm thinking about the logic of my own sentences there, but I've got a lot to cover here, so we're going to just keep moving. All right, then he gives an example of, oh yeah, you could have a priori knowledge if you saw somebody undermining their house, digging a ditch under the foundation of their house. You'd say, oh, that guy could have known before this experiment that that house is going to fall. Then Kant will say, yeah, but he wouldn't have known that had he not had previous sense impressions of things being heavy and therefore falling when their foundation is undermined. He might not have seen a house undermined before, but he could have seen someone kick a chair out from underneath a glass vase, and then the vase falls and crashes, and then he can, based on that previous sense impression, then he can predict, oh, here's a similar situation. I can, through a process of induction, assume that this house will probably also fall. But even that, you couldn't know for certain, because it's possible to imagine it just hovering there. And if it was truly a necessary thing that must necessarily occur, it would be impossible to even imagine it not occurring. That's another, it would be impossible to imagine it not happening. But it's easy to see a house hovering and not falling. You know, if you were out in space and you had a house on a platform in space and you took the platform away, the house would still just hover there because there's no gravity, or at least not enough to make it plummet all of a sudden. So it doesn't happen everywhere in the universe that if you undermine a house, it falls. Most of the universe, it wouldn't happen that way because most of the universe is empty space. But space, again, is a concept of the mind, an a priori category of thought. What does that say about the universe? To me, that implies the universe is a mental projection. And, but I'm not going to get into that. I'll wait until I might mention bits and pieces of that. But when we get into part 4 of the book, Reality, then I'm going to bring in, because the readings demand it, relativity theory, quantum mechanics, string theory, this idea of information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. But for now, we've got enough to tackle with Kant. So, page 86, left-hand column, chapter 2 of the Critique of Pure Reason. We are in a possession of certain modes of a priori knowledge, and even the common understanding is never without them. So I went over that with space. So let me just read bits and pieces here. What we here require is a criterion by which to distinguish with certainty between pure and empirical knowledge. Experience teaches us that a thing is so-and-so, but not that it cannot be otherwise. First, then, all right, so experience teaches us that a thing is so-and-so, but not that it cannot be otherwise. What I just said about you could imagine a house just hovering there, even if you dug a pit underneath of it. Sense impressions cannot give you certain information, knowledge that must necessarily happen, and it's impossible to perceive it happening otherwise. All knowledge from sense impressions gives you what David Hume called matters of fact. And you can always imagine matters of fact not happening that way. Whereas if you have certain knowledge, for example, mathematics, 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can pretend 2 plus 2 equals 5, but if you try to conceive that, you can't. You cannot form a clear conception of two objects and two objects combining, and then just 5. You just sneak in another one there. So these certain truths of deductive reasoning, you cannot imagine them being otherwise. Whereas the truths of inductive reasoning, based on a bunch of sense perceptions of things in the past, and then you infer a general rule because it's always happened that way in the past, but it is possible to imagine it happening in another way. You can imagine the sun not rising tomorrow, but you can't imagine 2 + 2 equaling 5. This is another one of those yogic tricks of the mind to discriminate in your mind the different types of knowledge. Empirical knowledge coming from outside, or at least coming from sense impressions, because Berkeley would say there is no outside, but empirical knowledge coming from sense impressions, and then what the rationalists would call is this innate knowledge, or what Kant is calling a priori categories of thought. If you make a truth claim, analyzing that claim can help you discern, is this an a priori category of thought that I'm getting this knowledge from, or is it some empirical sense impression? So I'll just keep reading here. First, then, we have a proposition which in being thought is thought as necessary. It is an a priori judgment, and if besides it is not derived from any proposition. All right, so first then, if we have a proposition which in being thought is necessary, it is an a priori judgment. I have a thought, oh yeah, that must necessarily be the case. A body is extended in space, that will be his example. That must necessarily be the case because it's simply the definition of a body. A body is a thing extended in space. You can't imagine a body not extended in space. You know, it's you can imagine, as I'm saying that, there's this old, the monks used to debate about how many angels can fit on the edge of a pin, and the answer was an infinite number because the angels don't have extension in space. Well, then do they have bodies? Well, not material bodies. So maybe I should have clarified a material body is extended in space. You can't conceive of that not being the case. All right, so therefore that's a priori knowledge. It's necessary. Secondly, experience never confers on its judgments true or strict, but only assumed in comparative universality through induction, as we went over. If you undermine a house, it will fall. I can imagine it not falling, therefore that must have been empirical knowledge that I've gained. That's true generally based on my past experience, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen. So, continuing on page 86, the right-hand column, if then a judgment is thought with strict universality, that is, in such a manner that no exception is allowed as possible, it is not derived from experience, but is valid absolutely a priori. So he's setting up the methods with which he's going to use to discern what parts of our knowledge come from innate principles, these categories of thought, a priori categories, and which parts of our knowledge come from sense impressions, which he agrees with Locke do come from outside of us, what he calls the unknowable thing in itself. But we can know it's outside of us, but we don't know what it is. Well, then other people say, well, if we don't know what it is, how do we even know it exists? But at any rate, so here's this he was saying, what we saw in the left-hand column, what we here require is a criterion by which to distinguish with certainty between pure and empirical knowledge. Here it is. You can know what empirical knowledge is and what a priori knowledge is by this criteria. He says criterion, but there's two. Necessity and strict universality are the sure criteria of a priori knowledge and are inseparable from one another. If you make a claim that must necessarily be true, you can't imagine it being in any other way, that's a priori knowledge. Similarly, if you make a claim which must be true everywhere in the universe, that's a priori knowledge. And if you have something that must be true everywhere in the universe, you automatically have the other. They come together. But you can use them separately, he says. So he's just giving you the methods by which to analyze your knowledge, because you're trying to discover what are these inborn categories of my own mind, forcing me to perceive things in a certain way. Well, what truth claim do I have? Then analyze it, and if it must necessarily be true, that truth claim is based in an a priori category of thought, which the claim you make could be imagined as the other way and not being true, then that knowledge came from empirical sense perceptions. So continuing on 86, now it is easy to show that there actually are in human knowledge judgments which are necessary and in the strictest sense universal, and which are therefore pure a priori judgments. If an example from the sciences be desired, we have only to look to any of the propositions of mathematics. If we seek an example, all right, so let's just, mathematics. This is the example of pure, but is it pure? Because he's going to go on to say that mathematics requires empirical observations. And this is going to introduce this concept of synthetic a priori knowledge. And I have a little chart, and I'll show you this, but so I'm going to continue here. He said, in the latter case, all right, so mathematics, if we seek an example from the understanding in its quite ordinary employment, the proposition, every alteration must have a cause, will serve our purpose. In the latter case, indeed, the very concept of a cause so manifestly contains the concept of a necessity of connection with an effect and of the strict universality of the rule, that the concept would be altogether lost if we attempted to derive it as Hume has done from a repeated association of that which happens with that which precedes, and from a custom of connecting representations, a custom originating in this repeated association and constituting therefore a merely subjective necessity. All right. Hume says we invent this idea of causal relationships upon which Newtonian physics is based, that we invent it based on repeatedly observing a sequence of sense impressions that happen in a predictably repeating pattern. And it's just a custom. We see it happen. People put their fingers near fire, they feel the heat repeatedly. Oh, fire must cause pain. The fire causes you to feel pain. This causal link we don't actually see. This concept of causality, which implies a law of nature that must always be true. Hume says, no, we don't know what causes it. We just know fire, put finger close to it, pain. The idea of this universal principle of causality, we instinctively insert into that relationship, or there's no relationship. There's event A, fire, event B, finger in fire, followed by event C, pain. And then we link these, we relate these ideas, because everything Berkeley showed and Hume agreed is an idea in the mind. Sense impressions are ideas in the mind. We relate these ideas in ways that help us make sense of the universe, but the way we relate these ideas don't necessarily have to be true everywhere. And we mistakenly assume we have discovered certain causal relationships that are always true. But Kant is just saying, well, here's the criteria of a priori knowledge. If you can't imagine it being otherwise, if it must necessarily be true in your mind and you can't even pretend that it could be otherwise, and that it must necessarily be true everywhere in the universe, then that knowledge couldn't have come from sense impressions. No matter how many sense impressions you've had, you can't develop the custom of linking them together by causal links, because the idea of causality contains within it automatic necessity and universality. The idea of cause means it must happen. This caused that to happen. It contains the idea of, you can't imagine, there's no such thing of a cause if it doesn't always work. So the very concept, because it's attached with necessity and universality, could not have been derived from empirical observations, as Hume has said. That's what he's trying to say. So if we didn't form a custom of linking our sense impressions together with causal links, then how did that occur? How does it occur? And this Kant is saying it automatically occurs because this category of thought, causality, is this category of our own mind that forces the flux of sense perceptions into orderly patterns. This is what he's trying to establish. So continuing on 86, at the bottom of the right-hand column, very last sentence, even without appealing to such examples, it is possible to show that pure a priori principles are indispensable for the possibility of experience, and so to prove their existence a priori. So now he's going to say, you wouldn't even have sense impressions of objects were it not for these a priori categories of thought. And the big one we went over already was space. This relationship of all your sense impressions are put into a context of space. And furthermore, he'll go on to say, after that, so he went on to say, remove from an object the weight, the color, and everything else, that you're left with empty space, you can't subtract that from your mind. Continuing, he says, again, if we remove from our empirical concept of any object, corporeal or incorporeal, so even spiritual bodies, all properties which experience has taught us, we yet cannot take away that property through which the object is thought as substance, or as inhering in a substance, although this concept of substance is more determinate than that of an object in general. Owing, therefore, to the necessity with which this concept of substance forces itself upon us, we have no option save to admit that it has its seat in our faculty of a priori knowledge. You don't experience a flux of unconnected sense impressions. You experience a continuous substance of an object. So fire is an object. It's made of the substance of fire. And that is how the ancient Greek and Indian, meaning India, the Hindu and Buddhists, they thought of basic elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. But the point I'm trying to make here is that your mind forces you to perceive objects and not discrete, unconnected sense impressions. You wouldn't have these empirical experiences of a world of interacting objects if they weren't already filtered through these a priori categories of thought. So the simple fact that you are experiencing objects enduring through space and time and interacting with each other in predictable ways or repeating patterns, the simple fact that that is occurring proves that you have a priori categories of thought. So the soul is not a blank slate. You have categorizing lenses of cognition built into your unconscious mind that automatically organize this volley, this flux of extremely rapid flux of sense impressions. That is what he's trying to say. And I think it makes sense. And I could get into some of these more details, but I do want to focus a little bit on mathematics, because this is so David Hume said mathematics, yeah, we can have certain absolute knowledge of mathematics, but mathematical principles do not necessarily relate to the empirically observable world. Or at any rate, mathematical principles do not necessarily relate to our sense perceptions, because Hume agreed with Berkeley. That's all we really experience is sense impressions. Who knows if there's some world outside of our sense impressions or not. But the point is, we can have certain knowledge of mathematics because Hume said humans just invented these rules. And if you make a rule in a game, then you can say that rule must always follow. Okay, fine. That doesn't mean that rule must always correlate to our world of sense perceptions. Kant is going to say, yes, it does, because we don't just invent mathematics in the mind arbitrarily. They have to correlate with empirical observations, and he'll make a distinction. You can have an empirical observation of these 5 fingers on my hand, or I can just as easily imagine them in my mind, but still, you need to have this image of objects to help you learn mathematical truths. Once you have that empirical observation, then you realize, wait a minute, this relationship must necessarily always hold true. You couldn't have learned this necessary universal truth without empirical observations, and yet once you make them, suddenly you've discovered necessary universal truth, which shouldn't be possible, because he said a priori knowledge. What's the criteria for differentiating a priori knowledge from empirical or from a posteriori knowledge? And that is necessity and strict universality. And yet here he's saying, here's this kind of this bridge. You can discover necessary universal truths about the correlations between mathematical truths and the physical world because mathematics and the physical world, or the unknowable thing in itself, they both are presupposing these a priori categories, such as space and cause and effect and time, the sequence of events. So I'm going to read some of what he had here, and I'm then going to read a little bit past our reading just to help us make some sense of it. But I'm going to skip over to, this is page 87, so chapter 3. Philosophy stands in need of a science which shall determine the possibility, the principles, and the extent of all a priori knowledge. Then over to the right-hand column, near about halfway down, he says, it is natural, that is to say, all right, even closer to the bottom, for one part of this knowledge a priori, the mathematical, has long been of established reliability, and so gives rise to a favorable presumption as regards to the other part of a priori knowledge. Now, what is that other part? I'm pretty sure he's talking about mathematical physics, natural philosophy, the study of the natural world, which may yet be of quite different nature. Besides, once we are outside the circle of experience, we can be sure of not being... All right, so here what he's doing here is complaining about people who have tried to learn absolute truths of the universe only using their reason independent of sense perceptions, and he accuses Plato of doing that, which is inaccurate. In some dialogues like the Phaedo, Plato implies that you should escape entirely from sense impressions to learn these absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. But in other dialogues like the Republic, which we'll be reading later in the book, he says you need to study nature in order to remember these absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, especially mathematics and the mathematics of geometry, and especially the mathematics of solid geometry and motion, which is astronomy and music, which teaches about time. If you study astronomy and music and learn the mathematical forms that describe them, that opens the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, which is the source of all knowledge. It's the source of consciousness. It's the source of the illusion of the material world. So at any rate, he attacks Plato there a little bit. I'm going to skip over that because I'm just trying to focus on his comments on mathematics. So page 88, up near the top on the left, mathematics gives us a shining example of how far independently of experience we can progress in a priori knowledge. It does indeed occupy itself with objects and with knowledge solely insofar as they allow of being exhibited in intuition. All right, intuition, that's the imagine, you imagine images in your mind. So he's saying that it does indeed occupy itself with objects and with knowledge solely insofar as they allow of being exhibited in intuition. So we need empirical observations, even if we only imagine them in our mind, to develop mathematics. And he says that is overlooked. And this has important consequences for why mathematics is capable of predicting the world of our sense perceptions. Because mathematics and our sense perceptions, they're empirical. Mathematics is linked to empirical imagination, if not actual observing objects, then at least imagining them in your mind. And I'm going to read this example of 7 plus 5 equals 12, which is not in our reading, but I'll just continue here. It does indeed occupy itself with objects and with knowledge solely insofar as they allow of being exhibited in intuition, but the circumstance is easily overlooked, since this intuition can itself be given a priori. All right, so I'm going to come back to mathematics after I go over chapter 4. This is page 88 on the right. The distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. So that's two of the questions for part B of the exam. Let me click back over here. Part B, number 8. What is the difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge? We already went over that. And number 9, what is the difference between analytic and synthetic judgments? Okay, so a priori knowledge prior to sense impressions, knowledge that does not come from sense impressions, such as space. We have knowledge of space. That's not empirically observable thing, and the idea of causality. A posteriori knowledge comes after. We learn it from sense impressions. That is, all right, so what's the difference between analytic and synthetic? That's where we are now. This is page 88. I got to be careful with this camera. All right, in all judgments in which the relation of a subject to the predicate is thought, this relation is possible in two different ways. Either the predicate B belongs to the subject A as something which is covertly contained in this concept A, or B lies outside the concept A, although it does indeed stand in connection with it. In the one case, I entitled the judgment analytic, in the other synthetic. So there you go, there's your answer. But that, I don't want you to just quote that couple of sentences. You have to understand what these terms mean. What's the significance of them? Why is he isolating these two different types of judgments? But let's just analyze what they are a little bit more. Page 89, up at the top of the left-hand column. If I say, for instance, all bodies are extended, this is an analytic judgment, for I do not require to go beyond the concept which I connect with body in order to find extension as bound up with it. Okay, so analytic judgment, subject and the predicate of a sentence. The subject is the thing that does the action, and the predicate is that which occurs. So, for example, I'm looking over the sheet. I might as well start going over this now. So here is just this sheet, and this will cover part B of the exam, questions 8 and 9, a priori, a posteriori, analytic and synthetic. What I'm seeing on the screen is a mirror image, so everything is reversed. But this analytic, the subject, the predicate belongs to the subject. So all bachelors are unmarried males. This is just a classic example. That would be analytic. You can know for certain that all bachelors are unmarried males because the subject, all bachelors, and then the predicate is are unmarried males. That's just the definition of a bachelor. You don't ever have to have met an actual bachelor. If you open up a dictionary, you read the definition, what's a bachelor? An unmarried male. So through analyzing that sentence, all bachelors are unmarried males. Does the predicate belong? Is it necessarily a part of the subject? Yes, that's its definition, so you can know that. Well, then, here's an example of synthetic knowledge. I'll go on to read his example, then I go back to my chart. So this, all bodies are extended. What is a body? It's a thing extended in space. So to say all bodies are extended, all you need to do is analyze the definition of a body. And then, so the predicate, are extended, does belong to the subject. Bodies, all bodies. All bodies are extended. So that's analytic knowledge. And it's a priori, because you don't have to have an experience of objects. You just have to have a definition of what an object is, and then you can gain that knowledge. So then I'll go on to meet with this predicate. I have merely to analyze the concept, that is, to become conscious to myself of the manifold which I always think in that concept. The judgment is therefore analytic. But when I say all bodies are heavy, the predicate is something quite different from anything that I think in the mere concept of body in general, and the addition of such a predicate therefore yields a synthetic judgment. All bodies are heavy. What's the definition of a body? An object extended in space. Is there anything about heaviness inherent to the definition of a body? No. But it's easy to see how you would say all bodies are heavy, because on planet Earth, any body that you pick up has weight. But if you go up to outer space, suddenly, if you drop that other body right next to you, it'll hover right next to you. So it's not an inherent necessary part of the subject. The predicate, are heavy, the predicate, which is are heavy, of that sentence, does not necessarily have to belong to the subject of a body. So, continuing here, he says, judgments of experience as such are one and all synthetic. Continuing down, I'm just going to skip a few sentences. That a body is extended is a proposition that holds a priori and is not empirical. For before appealing to experience, I have already in the concept of body all the conditions required for my judgment. I have only to extract from it, in accordance with the principle of contradiction, the required predicate, and in so doing can at the same time become conscious of the necessity of the judgment, and that is what experience could never have taught me. Any knowledge that you have that is necessarily true, that you can't even imagine it being otherwise, must be a priori knowledge. That was his first, the criteria for a priori knowledge, necessity and universality. So if you have knowledge which is possible to imagine being otherwise without a manifest contradiction, then that knowledge must be derived from your sense impressions. It's empirical knowledge. It's a posteriori, after experience. Okay, so I am going to, now we end on this right-hand column, so I'm going to continue to read here, but then I'm going to go on and read a little bit more from the Critique of Pure Reason that is left out in our book. So page 89 over on the right-hand column. But in a priori synthetic judgments, this help is entirely lacking. I do not have the advantage of looking around in the field of experience. Upon what, then, am I to rely when I seek to go beyond the concept A and to know that another concept B is connected with it? Through what is the synthesis made possible? Let us take the proposition, everything which happens has its cause. In the concept of something which happens, I do indeed think an existence which is preceded by a time, etc. And from this concept, analytic judgments may be obtained, but the concept of a cause lies entirely outside the other concepts and signifies something different from that which happens, and is not, therefore, in any way contained in this latter representation. How come I then to predicate of that which happens something quite different, and to apprehend that the concept of cause, though not contained in it, yet belongs, and indeed necessarily belongs to it? What is here? The unknown equals X, which gives support to the understanding when it believes that it can discover outside the concept A a predicate B foreign to this concept, which it yet at the same time considers to be connected with it. It cannot be experience, because the suggested principle has connected the second representation with the first, not only with greater universality, but also with the character of necessity, and therefore completely a priori, and on the basis of mere concepts. I'm going to go over this. Upon such synthetic, that is, ampliative principles, all our a priori speculative knowledge must ultimately rest. Analytic judgments are very important and indeed necessary, but only for obtaining that clearness in the concepts which is requisite for such a sure and wide synthesis as will lead to a genuinely new addition to all previous knowledge. And that's the end of our reading of Kant, which I'm sure didn't make all that much sense to you. Everything which happens has its cause. Is that true? He's saying once you think it, then you realize, yes, that is true, necessarily, everywhere in the universe. And yet, let's use his tests. Let's look at the sentence. Everything which happens has its cause. Everything which happens is the subject, has its cause is the predicate. Does the predicate necessarily belong? Is it contained within the concept of the subject? Everything which happens. Okay, let me just imagine. Everything which happens. Oh man, that's a lot of stuff. Everything which happens. Okay, what's the predicate? Has its cause. Everything which happens. Is there anything contained in that which, in the concept of that which happens, is the idea of cause inherent? He'll say no. I can't perceive it either. And yet he says, once you make that observation, oh yeah, it must have a cause. Everything has a cause. You know, you hear this? That was caused by me tapping the book. Everything you can do, you did it. You caused it to happen. Anything that all right. So when I was reading this, I'm like, it just doesn't seem that strong to me. I can imagine things happening without a cause. I think I can, but at any rate, I'm just going to stick to what he is saying. What you've discovered here is synthetic a priori knowledge. And this is how Isaac Newton gave us this absolute certain knowledge of the way human beings perceive the mechanics of the universe, because of this category of knowledge, synthetic a priori. So we've got 1 hour and 9 minutes. I don't like to go over an hour and 20 minutes because that's a normal class time. All right, so Analytic a priori. All bachelors are unmarried males. All you need to do is analyze the concepts in the sentence. And that helps you to clarify your concepts, but it doesn't give you any new knowledge. All bachelors are messy. Now there's something that's synthetic. There's nothing in the concept of bachelor that necessitates them being messy. However, after many observations, after many sense perceptions of bachelor pads, you have seen that almost invariably, or at least everyone you've ever met was, messy. Once they get married, then they're forced to be less messy, but while they're still bachelors, they're messy. But messy, the predicate, is not contained in the concept of bachelors. You've connected it based on sense impressions, but you can imagine a nice and tidy bachelor. So it can't be a priori knowledge because it's not impossible to imagine it otherwise. You can't imagine a bachelor being anything other than an unmarried male because the simple definition of a bachelor is that. All right, so now David Hume, he had two categories of knowledge, what he called relations of ideas and matters of fact. So this is where Hume would put relations of ideas, analytic a priori. And that's where he would put mathematics. Yeah, you can have certain knowledge of mathematical truths, Hume admitted, but that's just because mathematics are a human invention, and it's just a self-contained system where we made these arbitrary rules. So yeah, you make a definition, a bachelor's an unmarried male, fine. That must be true everywhere in the universe because you made this arbitrary definition, and math is the same thing. Says Hume. And then this would be matters of fact. So for Hume, this is relations of ideas, and this would be matters of fact, things you actually experience with your sense impressions. And of this, you cannot have absolute certain knowledge like you can in the relations of ideas. You can only have probable knowledge based on past experiences, inductive reasoning. What Kant is saying is, no, David Hume, math and natural philosophy, which is what they called physics back then, don't belong to analytic a priori, they belong to synthetic a priori. And with this special category, humans have the ability to expand our absolute certain knowledge as far as we like, because we can always add on through the process of empirical observation new absolute certain truths. And again, what can we be absolutely certain of? Not the way the thing in itself actually is, but we can be absolutely certain the way our sense impressions perceive or are presented to our mind. Our sense impressions of the unknowable thing in itself will follow very strict universal rules that we can discover. And this category he calls synthetic a priori. Through empirical observations, we can nevertheless discover things that must necessarily be true everywhere in the universe. And that is because he's saying you don't just make up laws in your head of mathematics. You have to include a synthesis of empirical observations. And his example is 7 plus 5. Fortunately, this old book so old that the pages are ripped out. So I'm just going to read a little bit here. So we ended here on page 89, which was chapter 4, the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. So the next chapter is chapter 5. In all theoretical sciences of reason, synthetical judgments a priori are contained as principles. So mathematical judgments are always synthetical. Hitherto this fact, though incontestably true and very important in its consequences, seems to have escaped the analysts of the human mind, nay, to be in complete opposition to all their conjectures. He's thinking about Hume here. For as it was found that mathematical conclusions all proceed according to the principles of contradiction, people became persuaded that the fundamental principles of the science also were recognized and admitted in this way. All right, so I'm going to skip a little bit. All right, we might indeed at first suppose that the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a merely analytic proposition, following, according to the principle of contradiction, from the conception of a sum of 7 and 5. But if we regard it more narrowly, we find that our conception of the sum of 7 and 5 contains nothing more than the uniting of both sums into one, whereby it cannot at all be cogitated what is the single number in which embraces both. The conception of 12 is by no means obtained by merely cogitating the union of 7 and 5, and we may analyze our conception of such a possible sum as long as we will, still we shall never discover in it the notion of 12. We must go beyond these conceptions and have recourse to an intuition, which is a mental image, which is the same as an empirical observation, which corresponds to one of the two, our 5 fingers, for example. All right, for I first take the number 7, and for the conception of 5, calling in the aid of the fingers of my hand as objects of intuition, I add the units, which I before took together to make up the number 5, gradually now by means of the material image of my hand to the number 7, and by this process I at length see the number 12 arise. So let's start with 7. All right, so here let's apply his methods of discerning a priori from a posteriori knowledge. One of those methods is the sentence structure. Does the predicate belong to the subject? Okay, here's the sentence. 7 plus 5 equals 12. What's the subject? 7 plus 5. What's the predicate? Equals 12. Is there anything in the subject that contains necessarily the predicate? 7 plus 5. Analyze 7 and analyze 5. Well, we have one number, 7. We have another 5. We put the two numbers together, there will be one number. But that number will be 12 is nowhere included in the definition of 7 plus 5. We have to actually make the calculation. So says Kant. So we start with 7. Okay, 7 now. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Once we've made that empirical observation, now we realize something. Oh yeah, it has to. I cannot imagine it equaling any other number. It's necessarily true everywhere in the universe that when you take 7 units and you add them to 5 others, you're going to have 12. That was not something you could have learned through analyzing the concept of 7 plus 5. You had to have a synthesis of this empirical image, be it outside on your hand or in your mind, with this. So this empirical observation connected or led to a necessary and universal truth. This is his big thing, synthetic a priori knowledge. That the world of mathematics, which even Hume admits does give us absolute knowledge that's always true everywhere, but he said it doesn't necessarily apply. It's not connected to the world of matters of fact because it has nothing to do with empirical observations. It's just human invention of the mind, relations of ideas. We come up with ideas and we relate them any way we want. Kant is saying, no, we can't just come up with the idea of 7 plus 5 equals 12 in our mind. We must employ some empirical image, at least in our mind. So that unites these two realms of knowledge that Hume gave us, relations of ideas and matters of fact. The two will never meet in any absolute necessary way, says Hume. Kant is saying, yes, they do. Math, which we know gives us absolute certain knowledge, is relatable to the world of empirical observations. In fact, it's inextricable. We must have these images. And earlier I mentioned, math also takes place in a concept of space and time and causality. Our mathematical understanding is contained in the same a priori categories of thought that are through which our empirical observations of the universe are filtered. And that's why mathematical physics does give us absolute certain knowledge of our empirical observations of the unknowable thing in itself. So again, Kant will say we don't have absolute certain knowledge of the way the world is in itself, but we do have absolute certain knowledge of the way it appears to us. All right, so I'm just going to reread these questions, and that will be, maybe I will actually go a little bit over an hour and 20 minutes just to. So this question, part A, question 3, how is Kant's view of knowledge different than the rationalists and empiricists' views earlier in part 3? Is his argument an improvement on the views of his predecessors? Why, and explain. All right, well, actually, we've gone over that enough. So this introductory level class, you don't have to master any of these philosophers, but if you get the basic ideas of what is a rationalist, what is an empiricist, and how does Kant kind of synthesize the two, then, and support your answer with pertinent quotes and a page number, then you'll be fine. Part B, question 8, what is the difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge? We went over that. A priori is before sense impressions, a posteriori is after sense impressions. And analytic and synthetic judgments. Analytic, you just analyze the sentence. Does the predicate belong to the subject? And if it does, then that's analytic knowledge. Synthetic is when the predicate does not belong to the subject, and that you have to connect one concept to another. And then synthetic a priori is when you connect through synthetic judgments one concept with another, you then realize, oh, that connection must always occur necessarily everywhere in the universe. And that kind of knowledge, he says, is mathematical physics. All right, that will be enough for this video.